All right, good afternoon and welcome back to the latest edition of Building a Winning Team. I'm Trevor Blair, founder and CEO of Blair Search Partners, and welcome to our March episode. We have with us today Dr. Laura Dietrich from the University of San Diego. I'll read a little bit about her background in a second here, but let me remind you, for those who are watching live, please feel free to drop questions in the chat, and we'll get to those as time allows as we have the discussion today. And so with that, Laura, thank you for spending a chunk of your afternoon with us.
It's always my pleasure, Trevor, to do anything with you and your team. So thank you for having me.
Yeah. I think our challenge here is going to be limiting it to just 45 minutes or so, because you and I could sit here and talk about the nonprofit sector all afternoon long.
Yes, who would want to be part of that?
And you and I go back many, many years. But let me start with your bio for those who may be new to you and your work. Dr. Laura Dietrich is Executive Director of the Nonprofit Institute and a Professor of Practice in Leadership Studies at the University of San Diego. Over the past 15 years, Dr. Dietrich has produced key research on major nonprofit trends, which we're going to talk about here today, including the strength of the nonprofit workforce, economic impact of nonprofits and philanthropy, grant making, nonprofit finance, strategy, and governance. She founded the award-winning San Diego Nonprofit Academy, a 2-day training program focused on the evolving needs of the nonprofit community. Dr. Dietrich also leads a National Executive Management Certificate for Catholic Charities USA and the Masters in Nonprofit Leadership and Management for the School of Leadership and Education Sciences at USD. Okay, well, with that, again, Laura, welcome. And why don't we start by talking about your research and this very important report that you and your team put out each year on the health of the nonprofit sector. And then from there, we're going to talk about recruiting and retention and also some very, very recent trends. But first, I thought I'd let you give us the 30,000-foot overview before we dig in.
Well, thank you, Trevor. So for those of you that haven't interacted with us, I'm sitting here today at my home at the University of San Diego in the Nonprofit Institute, where we are unapologetically all things nonprofit, and including education, research, capacity building, leadership development, and welcome nonprofits here in our school with open arms at all times. Sometimes universities can feel a little off-putting, but this is the home for nonprofits in San Diego. It's your academic home, so I hope you feel connected to us in some way, shape, or form. And the Institute, was founded over 20 years ago now. And at that time, nobody could tell you how many nonprofits were even in San Diego or anywhere else. Like, there really just wasn't any information on the nonprofit sector. And I say all of this because it's what sort of is the foundation for the work that we're going to talk about today. So we started off doing what nobody else was doing, which was just counting how many nonprofits there were, looking at all the IRS data, right, and saying, well, and so we came out with that sort of number that shocked people that they still quote today. There was 10,000, and then later there was 12,000, and now there's 13,000 nonprofits in San Diego County, right? And our work does extend beyond the county, but for purposes of this research, we tend to stay focused here. And then right after that, there was this little thing called the Great Recession, right? And
A little bit.
That really called for more real-time data, right? The IRS data that people get off the 990s that sort of run in the background of a lot of these, charity search engines and different things, they're really outdated. Right? By the time they get uploaded, they're about 2 years old. And people really wanted to know what's going on with leaders on the ground. So we started this State of Nonprofits and Philanthropy report to really show that nonprofits, yes, they have a social impact and they're very good at talking about that. But what we really wanted to do was carve out a space that showed they have a huge economic impact in any region, in our region especially. We did a larger study for all of California where we were able to account at least 15% of the gross state product comes from the nonprofit sector. And remember, we're the 5th largest economy in the world. So this is like nothing to sneeze at, right? Nonprofits are the 3rd largest employer, et cetera. And so when people hear that, they sit up a little bit more and think of nonprofits as job creators, as places for that stimulate economic activity. That calls a sort of a different lens to the work. So that is what is the underpinning of this work. And to so we survey leaders every year. Some of our colleagues think we're kind of insane for doing that because it's hard. It's hard work to do that every year. Some people are like, you can do it every other year, but once we started, we couldn't stop. And we've got public opinion surveying in there as well. So we know 4 times a year what San Diegans think about nonprofits, right? And then we have data straight from the Employment Development Department. So we have more information real time about employment. So anyway, that's the background to some of this work. So this year we produced this nifty report, right? It's called Bold Notes. It looks like it's on wrinkled paper. Because we really felt like, now's the time for the sector to be bold and to really kind of think about its role and its place in society. This year's data, I will say in this particular report, were gathered prior to the change in administration. And in fact, right before the election. So I don't think it changes some of the answers, but definitely some of the answers that I might have to your questions. So that, we can talk about that a little bit and kind of what some of those key findings and issues are if you want, or, it's broken into a bunch of different sections on the workforce, on major trends, on finance, on boards, on diversity, equity, inclusion, etc.
Well, and as you mentioned, the world has changed quite a bit. In a normal year, an election would be change. This has been a rather extraordinary year, even since the election. And I would imagine some of the things in the report are always on people's minds: talent acquisition and retention, diversity within the sector, stickiness, right? Are people finding, are they staying in the sector and finding a career path, or are they in and out? But you mentioned finance. Obviously, that's on everyone's mind, especially after a flurry of executive orders over the last few weeks. And so, 2-part question for you here. I know you've done some additional research since the report came out, and even since the executive orders have been hitting. And so, if it's not premature, I'd love for you to be able to talk a little bit about maybe some preliminary findings from that research. Literally like from last week.
Yes, it's not published. It's not published yet. It'll be coming out in full form, in bits and pieces. So we did do a very short window survey so that we could gather information. We heard from over 400 nonprofit leaders, which is a really great response in the region. And about the impact of executive orders and sort of shifting government policies, right? So we asked really early, and similar to what we did in COVID, we'll probably continue to ask at different points in time as things roll out. I think some of the findings are really not unexpected, but very, give us pause and think about it helps me think about the kinds of talent the nonprofit sector needs to attract, right? So we'll talk about that for just a second. So some of the key findings are, I would say, about 47% of the leaders that we surveyed really talked about, we asked them how they felt about these executive orders. And so 47% said they felt activated and ready to take some action. And 46% said they were concerned and really needed help connecting with other people and were having a hard time figuring out really what to do. Like, who do I call? These things are happening, and a lot of folks are experiencing things like not getting the calls back from federal partners. I think we should step back and say, how important is government money to nonprofits? Well, especially those nonprofits that tend to have large employee bases, right? At least a third of nonprofit funding, when you're looking at the sector as a whole, comes from government money. And a lot of the money that people get here in San Diego that comes through the county or the state sometimes has federal, originates from a federal source. So all of these orders impact that. And what we see is that folks are not prepared to, I mean, when you take all of the money that was taken out of USAID, for example, and shut down an agency that mostly funds NGOs and nonprofit work, that's going to have a huge impact, right? Especially, we're seeing immediate impacts in those organizations that work on the front lines of immigration. They've already felt it. We saw 15 out of 15 organizations that reported already laying off. They'd laid off 470 roughly employees, and that's in the last like 3 weeks, right? And then the vast majority said we haven't laid off, but we might expect to in the future. So there's some real disruption and some chaos in the sector, and just like in the federal government, and other places right now. So where that dust settles, it's going to really call on the kinds of leaders that can kind of really hold steady, right, during this space and time. And it's going to call a lot upon boards of directors, I think, to really be forward looking, to think about really be a good partner to their organization. Because for those people that lose that kind of funding, there is no way to fundraise your way out of that, right? There's no way private philanthropy and individuals will make up any gap that's of any significance in federal funding. So the sector has to start to think about working, in really streamlined ways. Because the other thing that will happen at the same time as the federal government retracts, right, the need for nonprofit services will just naturally go up. So how that's all going to get navigated and solved remains to be seen at this point in time. So good leadership is critical. Mm-hmm. And I see this, I will tell you, across the subsectors. We don't see a ton of variation if you're an arts organization or if you're in higher ed. But if you think of San Diego and some of our nonprofits, we're highly concentrated in that research and innovation space, especially health research. If NIH funding gets paused, think about all of the folks that are at universities in this region that are doing that kind of work. I don't think we think about that. Mm-hmm. We think maybe more of the human services, like the kinds of things we see, food banks and all of that being impacted, and they will be too. So I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, because I think actually data can help us really think strategically. But there are definitely things that I think as a region, we're going to have to address even more collectively than we have in the past. I'm just looking, because this is so hot off the date, I'm just looking off the press. I'm just kind of looking to see if there's any. And people aren't prepared. They don't really kind of know what to do. And because the unknown is there. And then the other thing that's interesting is a lot of organizations that are also express concern for their staff, many of whom maybe have family members that are undocumented, so there's just a lot of stress for people either working on the front lines or people receiving services that makes doing the work even harder than it already is.
Sure. A couple more questions kind of at the macro level,
Sure.
If I could, please. When I think back over, when I started my career working with the nonprofit sector, and I think about sort of industry trends and shocks to the system that I've experienced during my time in this space, I think back to, as you alluded to earlier, the Great Recession, the pandemic. Would you call it the winter of executive orders? Would you put that as sort of a third major shock to the system in the last decade and a half? I mean, are we talking potentially something on that scale that in 5 years we're going to look back and hopefully we're in a stronger place and we all get through it?
Sure.
But we're going to look back at this time and rank the winter of 25 right up there with the Great Recession and the pandemic, and how the sector had
what it was called,
got through it.
Yeah, what it was called to do, how it was called to evolve, right? I mean, if you think about COVID, all of a sudden we figured out ways to provide remote services to people and have remote remote work, right? But it wasn't at a cost. It still was quite, difficult to go through and to figure those things out. So this is all to say that I think the sector will figure it out, especially if boards are strong, if CEOs are strong, and they're thinking together. What won't work is if we have sort of deficit-based thinking, in the sense that if we all start to really compete with one another and not, we have to kind of take a really we're stronger together approach as a sector, right? This is what this sector was built for, to be compassionate, courageous, brave, right? And it's hard right now for some people to even speak out, which is unimaginable to me in the United States of America, but it's difficult, and they're worried about persecution and funding, but all because, not because anyone's getting rich off that money, because they use it to serve their missions, to serve and make San Diego and other places a better place to live. So yeah, it remains to be seen. It's early days, but one of the questions we asked was how much time is just understanding the executive orders and trying to get answers. How much is that taking up of your time? And moderate to fair, and very, most of the answers were a lot of time. Yeah. And so, time is money in the nonprofit world, just like in any other space. And so, I just feel like the other thing that I think probably most of your audience probably realizes, but I think it's important to note, that when you receive money from the federal government or government contracts, most of the time you're working on a reimbursement model, which means you've done all your work, laid out all your salaries and employees and paid them already. And then you submit a bill. And then if somebody's going to pay the bill, you've got serious problems, which ties to some of the other trends in the report, in that we already know that some nonprofits were having some trouble, making their budgets last year. So this is not to say that I don't want to paint the sector with a wide brush. There's lots of good nonprofits that are financially stable and doing really great things. And in fact, if you're talking, sometimes people ask me on these kinds of calls, especially for younger folks, what do you recommend when you go to look for your first nonprofit job? And I always say, go with a known entity, maybe not your passion project just yet, maybe a place that has lots of employees and different things, because there's some stability there, and then get ingrained. But yeah, it'll be interesting, Trevor. I wish I had a crystal ball, but I don't. But I can't see things getting fundamentally resolved quickly.
Well, and if we did, it wouldn't be as fun and exciting, right? Because it takes out the surprise.
I don't know if it's fun, but it's definitely there's definitely work to be done for sure.
Well, and I want to make sure we circle back to the topic of talent development and building one's career, as you just alluded to. But I just want to point out that you raised a great point about early career nonprofit professionals or aspiring nonprofit professionals, that I think it's a great suggestion to round out your experience and work with large organizations and small organizations at different points in your career, so you see how things are done at different levels, right? Sure. Especially in fundraising, right? It's good to spend some time in a big shop where you've got very specialized roles, so you can see what it looks like if someone goes really, really deep in one discipline around fundraising, right? Whether it's major gifts, planned giving, prospecting, database management, et cetera, et cetera. But then it's also great to spend time inside a small nonprofit where you are wearing all the hats, and where you may play 10 different roles, because it gives you that opportunity to experience all of those different functional areas and adapt and evolve as a professional. So, that's one of the things that I like to share with prospective candidates when they ask, well, should I go with this organization or that one? I'll often go back to them and say, well, where are you at right now? What's missing in your sort of portfolio of experience? And that may help guide you towards one or the other. Again, assuming that, comp and title and all the basic components are the same. Sometimes in your career, it may make sense to go with the smaller organization. Sometimes it makes sense to go with the larger organization. But pulling back to our kind of macro level conversation about the moment, You and I both have colleagues in Phoenix and Seattle. Are you, when you talk with other thought leaders in the sector around the country, is it a consistent story, everything that we've just been talking about? Is this sort of a national feeling that, kind of everything we've been talking about over the last 20 minutes would apply wherever you are in the country?
It's interesting. So I was with some colleagues in January, and in California, and I would say in Washington to some degree. We're living in a little bit more of a bubble in the sense that my colleagues in Florida and Texas have been dealing with some of these kinds of orders through their legislature, for several years now, about what you can say, what you can't say, what they'll fund, what they won't fund. Based on your orientation to their to the and how that aligns with whatever the political issue is at the moment. So I think other parts of the country have been grappling with this a little bit more than us. We have a lot of protections here in California. I mean, my colleagues at Cal Nonprofits are doing a really great job, and so statewide associations I think are really important right now. But yeah, very similar. So prior to this call, I would say some of the big trends. I mean, we're looking around this idea of burnout, right? There's some national movements around strengthening the health and well-being of the nonprofit workforce, shoring it up as we, when I started my career, there was going to be an executive transition of the likes of which we've never seen, right? But then we had the recession and nobody retired, right? So from your business, and I know from following things, that now that is starting to happen and more people are retiring. And so I think in the talent space, there's issues around succession planning that needs to be done, and kind of this realization that some of that stuff's starting to happen. These organizations need leaders. Some may go away, but the nonprofit sector is not going away anytime in the near future, and so it'll be called upon even more than ever. So I think there's some of the talent issues, definitely concepts around diversity of thinking, of representation, of community voice, of equity. I think those are predominantly values of most nonprofits. And so we're seeing positive movement towards that space versus sort of the older model of sort of a charitable handout. And, so people are spending a lot of time, and a lot of these organizations are cropping up are in their own communities, right? Because they're trusted more, right? We know nonprofits from our research are more trusted than government and business to do a whole host of other things, right? And that's because they can go places and spaces that government and corporate entities can't or won't go, right? So the big guys are great and really important in terms of the sector, but the small ones are just as important because they serve unseen populations. They make, if we're here, they make any community a better place to be, a better place to live, a safer place, a more educated space, a place with arts and health and environment, good, safe environments and outdoor space. So they're really what make communities great, right? And special places to live. So, so I think in terms of the workforce, those kinds of trends are what we were seeing before. They're still the same now. I mean, burnout will become even more real, right? If you're asked to do, more work with less staff, more work, greater need, more people showing up needing you, but you don't have the funding to serve them, those kinds of things. So you kind of have to steel yourself, right? For that. But I like to frame it sort of as an opportunity. So what kind of talent do we need to work in a place like that? Right? People who are super resilient, who have really creative solutions, who can see how different kinds of issues intersect and how to bring more organizations together. I think are those kinds of skill sets for me are kind of ecosystem thinkers, if you will, and people that think about root causes. Those things, we don't need automatrons just doing the same thing over and over and over again, because the sector is going to be asked to do things differently. So how can we get ahead of this? Why do we have to be at the back end of, in this reactionary space? We don't, and we aren't. We should be very, we can lead on these issues across the board, all these organizations. So it's been a little shocking, right? The winter of, I'm going to use your phrase, the winter of it, but I have every bit of faith that that the sector is up to the task.
Yeah. One last question on this before we dig deeper into the report. I was meeting with a CEO of a very large human services organization last week in the 100 million and above bracket. And we were talking about a lot of these things, and he and his board had just gone through a very interesting exercise, a very simple exercise, but one that I thought was very smart, and to me seemed like it would have applicability whether you're north of 100 million or south of 1 million, right? And it was taking the old stress test model that was used during, going back to the Great Recession, the stress test model that was applied to banks, right? If they had lost so many of their deposits, and what would happen if they lost the next X percent? And he and his board did an exercise, and they looked at, okay, what if, and I can't remember what the piece of their funding that was either directly federally supported or indirectly federally supported, but anyway, it's not insignificant. And they went and they did a simple exercise and said, look, what if we lose 5% of our funding? What does that look like for our organization? What if we lose 10? And what if we lose 20? And I don't think they went past 20 to the total doomsday scenario, but just to start to think about what would a contingency plan look like, but also how does our thinking need to shift at these different levels? Is that something, the stress test approach, is that something that you have heard people talking about? Does that sound to you like something that an ED or CEO might want to talk about doing? Budgets?
I was talking to maybe the same, a similar leader of a large human service organization last week about this. And it was kind of funny because that person said, I think the sector really needs help with, you can call it stress tests or scenario planning, right? So everyone tells you you're supposed to do scenario planning, but secretly everyone's like, well, what is that? They said, I know people that have 2 scenarios, and I know people that have 18 scenarios, right? So one of the things we're looking at here, and I was talking to some finance folks today, is how can we help, right? So a 100 million plus organization is going to have the kind of board and consultants and those kinds of things that are going to say, let's stress test this at 5%. But even just that little message that you just gave is fantastic. What happens, and this is where boards are critical, because their finance committees and their their finance team, their staff should be working this angle, right? Likewise, what happens if I have a colleague that talks about this a lot, that tells nonprofits, tell me what you're going to do if I gave you $1 more tomorrow. So I think what you're getting at is something I did want to talk about on this call just a little bit, is one thing I've noticed that is missing in the sector, not carte blanche, so don't write a bunch of negative things in here, but in general, financial acumen is missing to some degree at senior levels and I would be one of those persons. I'm not a finance person, but I'm working with a lot of executive leaders. And how do they get to those positions, right? They were the COO, they were the second in command, they came from a smaller nonprofit, or, they came up the program side, but they have a degree in English or, which is all good. That doesn't mean they're not prepared, but there's still some level of financial acumen that I think other people that are interested in work and applying to kind of the jobs that you have, if you want to talk about beefing up a skill, I think really understanding how to do that really understanding nonprofit finance in particular, because it is different than what you would get in an MBA program or a regular finance course, understanding that and not leaving it just to the CFO. I will say one thing about the $100 million organization, right, is they're going to have that talent pool available to them, most likely. But sometimes you look at the CEO and that's not their background. And so I don't know, if I was the CEO of something, I'd really want to understand. And the other thing that's in this report that we talked about is that most nonprofit organizations budget on 1-year cycles. So what does that mean? Like in our survey from this past fall, I just put that in as a question because we've been looking at multiple year budgeting as a capacity we want to build. And 91% of our respondents told us they work off 1-year budgets. Wow. And so how do you do a stress test if you're only looking at things in 1-year increments, right? And why do they do 1-year budgeting? You really have to look at the root of where nonprofits get their funding from, right? So if funders are funding in 1-year increments, or annual campaigns are being done, without multiple year pledges, it's really hard to know what's going to happen. But you can always so that's the scenario like in year 2 and in year 3. So can we start to build capacity in these areas? That's my question. And number 2, for the field that you're in, can we start to attract more people that have this kind of talent so that we can build up our organizations to think, in these longer periods of time?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're looking at the financial resiliency of the organization, but you're also looking up and down your org chart and you're looking at the talent resiliency.
Yes.
That do we have the right talent in-house right now to sustain us through some potentially bumpy times ahead. So thank you for kind of playing with us up at the macro level here before we kind of dig deeper into the report. Switching to the report, I loved the summary section that you put together with the big takeaways. Oh. And one of them that really struck me, and I should have written the exact numbers down, but I think the gap was something like 20% or something like that. And what it was an analysis between the percentage of folks who want to stay in the sector.
Oh yeah, I love that section.
Versus the percentage of folks who think they actually will stay in the sector. And there was a gap between the wanting to, but actually will. Mm-hmm. And to me, that gap struck me as sort of your employee engagement gap.
Yes.
If you are trying to build a brand, build an organization, before looking outside, looking inside and doubling down on employee engagement, because as a recruiting firm, we'll be the first to tell you that it's way more expensive to go hire a new person from the outside than it is to retain someone that you've already got on the inside who you've already invested years training. Mm-hmm. Does that ring true to you, that there's a major gap between, again, wanting to stay in the sector, but actually feeling that they will remain in the sector?
Well, there's a couple issues that feed this finding, if I had to guess. Like, we don't have exactly all of their motivations behind this, but one is, if you're looking at places like San Diego or Seattle, right, there's a very real cost of living issue, right? So, so let's start with the very good news. Guess what? And this was pretty surprising to me. I don't know why it was surprising. It just was kind of nice to see. Most people that work in the nonprofit sector want to stay in the sector. So, when the Great Resignation was happening and all these people were leaving for all these other jobs, I just thought it was really interesting that most people that are here, that are committed nonprofit professionals, want to stay in the nonprofit sector. So that's the number one. When you move down to the staff level, because we did include staff this time in this, whether they can or not, there's two things that sometimes feed this: student debt at the lower end of the pipeline, right, or the entry level. I'm going to say hierarchy, but the entry level of the pipeline. Student debt makes things very real for people, right, and then the cost of living in the area that you're in. It's very expensive to live here, so I think that engagement is part of it. but really understanding, and I've seen some nonprofits do a really good job with this, really understanding what are we trying to do? What is the outcome we're trying to produce? What is the best staffing structure to do that? And we're going to invest in that, right? So it's one thing I think to say that you and I both know this. Nonprofits, people can say, oh, nonprofits get paid less. But you and I both know that talented people get paid. But, there are places that pay just fine. And there are places where you can get benefits. And it's just like, you can work at Starbucks or you can work at a mom and pop coffee shop. And it's going to be a different pay scale and it's going to be a different benefit structure. And the sector is made up of all those things. So employee engagement, super important, I think, for retention, letting people try on new hats, like you said, if you can't give them, but you're going to have to probably hit that mid-range of pay. A lot of people ask you probably, you have to set a salary every time you go to hire you do a search, right? And so, what is that rate of pay that the organization can absorb and that people want to earn? So I think, but to step all back on all that to say that this is really a board discussion. Like boards need to have a discussion about how do we, what is our investment in our workforce, right? Nonprofits are essentially run on people power, right? It's not, we're not asking for new operating systems, although they might be, but essentially they're run on people. So to invest, what do you want to invest in that most important element of your organization? So there's a group in town. They haven't said I could say their name, so I won't, but they did a really interesting thing. Their board did something super interesting. They said, you know what? We're not going to grow anymore until we get our employees to this level of salary and to this level of benefits, because that's the most important thing imagine that not being oriented to growing. We're all like primed. We should grow. We should get bigger. Right. And they did it. And they added, some basic family leave and all these other kinds of things. But that board set policy. So anything around engagement, policy, pay, all of that's going to be reflected in the budget, right? Professional development, all those things. So yeah, you're right. I think, if you're looking at how to be a sought after employer, everyone knows the reputation. The sector is so small. Everyone knows who the good ones are and the bad ones are, right? A lot of times. So be a good place, be a good employer.
Yeah.
Right.
And one of the tactics that we often share when we're speaking, in fact, I think we talked about this at the symposium back in January. I want to get back to and talk about that a little bit too. One of the biggest and most often asked questions that we see is how do we compete with the corporate sector? Our budget can't compare, and they can throw all these perks at them, higher salaries, et cetera, et cetera. And we all know that the number one reason why an employee leaves their organization is not because of money or anything else. It's because of their relationship with their direct supervisor.
That is correct.
And that is something that every organization has 100% control over.
That is correct.
And a lot of times it's not that their supervisor is not a great person and they're not doing a great job and everything. It's the feeling of connectivity, especially for frontline programmatic staff who maybe, were coming of age during the pandemic and who never had that ability to shadow and be mentored and whatnot. More than anything else, direct reports just want your time. Mm-hmm. They want to feel connectivity to the person who supervises their work and to who guides and influences their career. But also that's how they learn and grow. Most of it is not through conferences and formal training programs. It's through osmosis and being a fly on the wall and being able to see their supervisor in different situations and how they handle those, both from a behavioral skills perspective, but also from a strategy perspective as well. And the disconnectedness, that gap we were talking about, is often due to the fact that they don't feel a strong personal and professional connection to their direct supervisor.
Yeah, and that's so easy to fix. I mean, it sounds time consuming, and remember, everyone's busy, but yeah, that's such a little investment, short-term investment for long-term gain. And we all know people, we've all worked for places where we felt it one way and we felt it another way. So I think the other thing is when the board is hiring the CEO, or the CEO is hiring the executive team, or the executive team is hiring middle managers, you want to be listening for that. How do you care for the people that work for you? Right? What's your philosophy on that? Right? And then kind of constantly paying attention to that climate and that culture in the organization to see, to see if it's being enacted or not. Right? High turnover is the first place to look. That's your first warning sign, right? Increased absenteeism, those kinds of things. Then it's time to do some investigating. But again, you got to be a good place to work.
Yep.
Right? And there's lots of ways you can do that don't involve necessarily money. But you're right. Number one reason people leave is their boss.
Yeah. I mean, time is the most precious non-renewable resource. Right? You can always throw more money at somebody. You can't make up for lost time. And not only is it the amount of time, but it's the quality of time. And so we recommend having at least a monthly one-on-one with your direct reports outside of the office, where you are uninterrupted, connecting as human beings, building those relationships and that connection that can weather the ups and downs of, the winter of executive orders and other job offers flying around and whatnot. So I'll stop there, but it's just something that I feel so passionate about, and it's so simple, and yet we all get so busy, and I think it's the first thing to fall by the wayside when a stressed out CEO is trying to hold an organization together.
Yeah, and then, this is another place where a board can be helpful, because a board should be doing the same thing for their CEO. One of my favorite comments I had from a nonprofit leader in town was, things really turned around for me and my board when my board chair said, "What keeps you up at night?" Right? And having that support. So that support goes there and then maybe flows downward or outward, if you will. But, I think it's really great that you can point that out, because that's your area of expertise. And I'm glad it connected to the stuff that we're doing, because you see it way more than I do.
Oh, yeah.
I do see any given week 28 nonprofit professionals in different classes if I'm teaching or whatnot. So I get to see the insides of a lot of organizations from that perspective. But definitely. We see that in some of the qualitative answers for this year's report too. Just people get up in the morning and they want to do good things, right? So give them the opportunity to do that.
So with regards to the report, I'm sure a lot of it is more trend monitoring and trend analysis as you're looking year over year, right? Not 1 year shifts, but how has this statistic changed over, say, the last 5 years that we've been doing with the report? But my question is, looking at either the qualitative or the quantitative, was there anything in this year's report that really surprised you, or I don't want to say caught you off guard, but really caught your attention? Again, either a quantitative trend or a qualitative piece of feedback that an individual gave you.
Okay, so we're seeing the tail end trends. Okay, so the sector continues to grow, right? It's bigger every year, more nonprofits, more assets, more revenue, etc. The workforce continues to grow, although the pace at which the workforce is growing is slowing just a little bit. So I'll just, this is kind of an academic comment, but if you look at the pace of employment, nonprofit employment over the Great Recession, which sounds like it was so long ago, and COVID, net employment went up. I'm not saying that it didn't go down in certain subsectors. Sometimes like the arts gets hit really hard, or some other sector gets hit really hard. But the net employment has continued to grow. So the workforce has continued to grow. So one of my colleagues basically called it recession-proof, the recession-proof workforce, right? That doesn't mean all great things happen, but I just want to say that this is a big 1 in 3 jobs is at a nonprofit. This is a big, viable, wonderful place to go to work. So that's one thing that I noticed, right? And that continues. We have been tracking, and we were one of the first organizations to really sort of track progress around diversity, equity, and inclusion metrics. In San Diego, and so we see that upward trajectory. So we ask a question. I forget, like, how satisfied are you with your ability to discuss issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And then the next question is, how satisfied are you with your organization's progress towards goals in that area? And they're always a differential. Like, they know people were really, in like 2017, people were really like, yeah, we're pretty willing to talk about it, but we're not happy with the progress that we're making. And we've just seen an nice upward trajectory on that over, on whole over since 2017, since we've been tracking that data. Now, apparently, we're not allowed to say some of those words. What will that be? What will that look like? I mean, I hope it doesn't look like anything. I hope people are deeply committed, right, to the values behind each one of those words, right? And so what will that look like at nonprofits? We did see in the report some qualitative responses around, we were getting a little pressure to not be so focused on board diversity and some other stuff, right? I wouldn't say it was a whole trend, but just some language around that. And, that sort of begs the question, people really need to understand why that was an important thing to be working on. Let's see what else was in there. I think there was that we've tracked for a long time. It's funny, every year we ask, how's your financial position and what's your financial outlook for next year? And it's always it's always more positive than I think it should be. And so I just wonder, are we wearing, do nonprofit leaders wear rose-colored glasses? And then I came to this sort of conclusion that they don't. They really believe in themselves to make it happen, right? And so this is kind of nuanced, but underneath, so we looked at that. We looked at the ones that said they were really confident in their financial outlook for next year, even though we hear that individual giving is shrinking. Even though now we have these executive orders, this was a little bit before that. But I'm like, well, what makes them have this confidence, right? And one of the people on my team sort of unpacked some of it and looked at the qualitative answers. And one of them was, people said, the ones that were really confident said, we've made some really strategic hiring decisions around talent. And we have the right people. So we feel like we're going to, that's why why we have this sort of more rosy outlook. That was one of the first things that came up. I thought that was really interesting. Like, we feel good about where we're at. Those organizations tended to have more of a rosy outlook for their finances. I will say, though, that overall that number shrunk. The number of people that felt really optimistic about their financial position shrunk just a little bit this last year. So that kind of walked back a little bit. I think we've been at this long enough that, I have gray hair now and we have longitudinal data. So that are interesting, right? Mm-hmm. I will say, for your colleagues and listeners and folks that follow you from other regions, when we've done this work in other places across California, in Santa Barbara and a couple other regions, we tend to not be that different than the rest of the United States. Like, the trends tend to be kind of the same. Like, the proportionality of our sector is no different than there's nothing, I hate to say it, like, in that respect, nothing that really sticks out that makes San Diego super different. So I hope that some folks can take some, take some of what we found, and hopefully it sounds a lot like what's going on in their neck of the woods.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's good to know that that we are all in this together and seeing and experiencing the same things, because when seismic change happens, it can also be very isolating, because we instantly go to think, what does this mean for me and my organization? Sure. And you're so focused there that you forget, my colleagues in my entire sector is in this with me. Yeah. And there is strength and there's safety in numbers.
Yeah. And if we get pushed by our sort of resource dependencies to see each other as competitors, right? I really see when groups come together, they get more. They just do. So we have to really be careful to not get caught up in the fray of this polarization to the extent that we don't work together, we don't advocate together, we might not all be looking for the same outcomes in our missions. Like the sector is a pluralist place, right? There's people that have opposing missions, if you will. But in general, this is a sector that's different than the corporate and the government sector, and it should be different, right? It should be different. It's the sector that reflects the values that we hold as human beings, right? Because a nonprofit gets started because somebody sees something wrong, right? So we got a little LinkedIn user.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, I won't read it because we can all see it on the screen there.
I can see it. I just hadn't seen one pop up yet. So yeah, it's just, some of this will require adaptation, wholesale change to the way but at the end of the day, why are we doing what we're doing? We have to focus not on what we do, because we're all primed to tell everybody what we do, right? You can take a little of the Simon Sinek's video or whatever. Mm-hmm. Why do you get out of bed in the morning? It is to produce a social good, if you will, to produce some kind of social change. So one thing I will say that a tool that leaders really have to get better at is, can you provide evidence that what you're doing works? And I'm not saying some big pre and post, big, long, longitudinal study. Do you have any data that shows what you do works? Right? Because if you gather that and you find out what you're doing isn't working, you need to change it. So we need to do all of this. Why do we get out of bed in the morning? Because we're trying to let's just be silly. I mean, let's just be sort of, big thinkers about it. Change the world, right? And so we have to really interrogate how we do things as nonprofits, why we do them, have a critical perspective on are we just set up to manage the way funding has come to us, or are we in the driver's seat, really pushing what's best for our communities, right? We're on the front lines, we're boundary spanning organizations between what we see and understand that people need and the folks that want to help that. So how do we navigate that? I think it's the most exciting part of the work. It's like really complex work, right? People think, you work for a nonprofit. What's the first thing people say? Oh, that's so nice of you. you are so that, or they say to me, they're like, do you still teaching that fundraising? I'm like, I don't know anything about fundraising. That's not what I do, right? They think that's what they have mental models of how the sector works, and it's not, they're not fully formed, right? So that's our job, all of our jobs, to really let people know what happens if we're not there, and to remind people of their values. It's okay to have compassion, right? It's okay to show mercy. It's okay to show mercy. It's okay to love your neighbor. And that's where this stuff happens, right here in this sector, and all the good stuff. So,
well, I think we need a whole lot more of all of that right now. So, Dr. Laura Dietrich, anything, we're nearing our time here together today, but is there anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like to touch on before we wrap up here? I know we've covered a lot of ground, right? We started about 100,000 and then drilled all the way down to basically strategies for conducting your monthly one-on-ones. But
thank you for that. I want people to be proud of themselves, proud of the work that they're doing, right? Wherever we can get strength from each other, we need to draw on that, right? Because it's buckle in time for some of us, for some organizations especially. And there'll be a lot of people coming at you, telling you what you should do this and you should do that. And no offense, but consultants will be coming and all the things, right? Foundations will be coming. So I think the closer you can sort of stick to the people that you serve, right? And what do they need? And how is what you're doing changing their lives? Keeping it very simple, right? And staying kind of in that and staying true to your own organizational values, that'll see you through, right? That's every day. I never cease to be amazed by the multiple talents of the people that I have the privilege of coming into contact with, right? It's like I could never do the work that they do. It's so amazing. And so I just think whatever we can do to uplift our work, to not get caught up in the fray, to hold the space for the sector as leaders, I think that's kind of really a note I would want to leave this group anyway. And that it's just a privilege to be anywhere near them, in my opinion. You probably feel the same way, Trevor, given your business.
Yes, agree. And my piece that I would add to that, I talked about it earlier, is that in times of trouble, we naturally kind of start to look inward. And that can be very, very isolating, especially now that we have virtual meeting tools like the one we're using right here today. But that's because we want to be able to share this with our colleagues around the country. I'm a big believer in the power of in-person meetings. Mm-hmm. And during these super challenging times, we need more in-person stuff, not less. That's why your symposium is so great every year, right? We need things like that bring colleagues together to have conversations around this stuff. If nothing else, to say, hey, how are you feeling? How have you been impacted? What's on your mind? Because, all these executive orders, they may hit the sector as a whole, but they're impacting organizations and individuals in very different ways. And the conversation you're going to have with a colleague in a Zoom meeting is going to be very different than the conversation you're going to have with a colleague over coffee, or conversation you're going to have with a colleague as you're walking out of a workshop together at a conference, right? And so, in my opinion, a lot of the not only relationship building, but a lot of the breakthrough ideas come from those impromptu, serendipitous conversations that can only happen by being in the same physical place at the same time. As an example, meeting someone on Zoom versus meeting them in the coffee shop, right? When you're meeting them over coffee, you're standing in line waiting to put in your coffee order and chit-chatting. That's a very different conversation than when you actually have your coffees and you're sitting down and, okay, now we're talking more work stuff. In Zoom, the open-ended, creative, chit-chatting, relationship-building stuff is kept much more to a minimum because Zoom is just set up for kind of exchanging information in a two-dimensional format.
Yeah.
And so I think, during these really challenging times, lean into your network, do more in-person stuff, not less. Because I guarantee you're going to come away happier. You're going to come away more inspired and engaged, and probably come away with more ideas on how to not only survive, but maybe even thrive during these super challenging times. So I want everybody to get at least one coffee meeting, one happy hour on their calendar this week that they didn't already have. And
you're always good for that, Trevor, and have it with Trevor because he's wonderful company in a coffee or cocktail meeting. But I really appreciate you and you taking the time to kind of think about the sector in this way and letting me sort of muse on about research and philosophy and kind of what's going on right now. But I will just add one thing to what you said, Trevor, which is that I think meeting in small groups with not to just a small group of like 5 or less. I mean, just to hold on to some folks, especially if you're an executive, it's really lonely at work at the executive level because you don't really have a peer. So I think, there'll be plenty of times to gather in big forums and whatnot, but to kind of start to form some groups to share information and whatnot, I think is really helpful. We saw that during COVID, especially too.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the USD nonprofit symposium is only once a year, so we're going to have to create other opportunities for the other 11 months.
Yeah, well, people are free to reach out to me anytime, LinkedIn and all the things. And we have this report is there, and our latest one will be coming out, and we can go through all the nitty gritty and all the subsectors and how the executive orders are kind of impacting them in that.
Fantastic. Dr. Laura Dietrich, many thanks for spending a big piece of your afternoon with us here today. And many thanks also to our viewers for your very thoughtful comments that you've been sending in. Kristen Wiggins and Katina Evans and Christoph Hilscher, thank you. I know there were a bunch of others that we didn't have a chance to get to, but thanks for joining the conversation. As I mentioned earlier, we do it every month. Please connect with us on LinkedIn, or you can reach us via our website to stay up to date on future episodes and other content that relates to the nonprofit sector that we're putting out each month. So with that, I wish everyone a very happy and productive March. And we look forward to seeing you again in April. And another big thank you to everyone who supports this sector and for all you do that makes it happen out there on the front lines. Big thank you. All right, everyone. Until then, thanks.